Hello students, this is a narrated PowerPoint on doing word studies, exegesis, and the original text. Let me start with some general principles of doing word studies. First of all, biblical authority in the original text, some cautions related to these. Here's one caution. Don't use the power of, quote, the Greek says, or the Hebrew says, to gain authority over your audience. Sometimes a pastor will say, now the literal meaning of this Greek word is, and sort of a hushed awe comes over the congregation as they wait to see the secret meaning that no one could tell by reading the English. That's the first principle. Don't use that to exert authority. Only refer to the original Greek or Hebrew when it provides insight that cannot be seen in the English translation. Generally, our English translations are excellent, and they actually describe exactly what the Greek means, or very close to what the Greek means. We should build confidence in our hearers in terms of the meaning of the text, not break down that confidence by constantly saying the word actually means this. Probably 70 or 80% of the time when someone says the Greek meaning is, I tend to cringe, because normally what follows is actually a fallacy, as we'll see. Here's a third point. Authority lies in the meaning of the text, not in the mysteries of Greek or Hebrew words. And the meaning of the text is communicated well by English translation. So this whole PowerPoint is going to point out a number of errors that are commonly made and encourage great caution when doing word studies. Let's start with some basic principles for word studies, basic principles of lexical semantics. Lexical semantics means the study of word meanings. Here's the first principle. Words generally have a semantic range, not one all-encompassing meaning. In other words, not a literal meaning. Consider the word field, for example. What does the word field mean in English? You might say, what is the literal meaning of the word field? Well, field doesn't have a literal meaning. It can mean a variety of things. It can mean a meadow, for example, in sort of uncultivated land. He saw a deer in the field. It can mean a cultivated piece of land, as in a farm. He planted corn in his field. Those are two different kinds of fields. It can mean the background area. The flag had stars on a field of blue. It can mean a topic or subject of academic interest, as in the field of mathematics. It can mean the area where a sport takes place. The players took to the field. What's the literal meaning? Well, the word field doesn't have a literal meaning. It has a semantic range. And the same is true of biblical words. Here's the Greek word charis. Sometimes it'll say now the literal meaning of the word charis is grace, but in fact that's not actually true. Charis has a semantic range. Ephesians 2:8-9, for it is by grace you've been saved through faith. Well, grace means undeserved favor in that context. But in another context, grace means favor earned. Do not be afraid, Mary, you have found favor with God, Luke 1:30. Or especially in Luke 6:32, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Charis in that context means favor that's earned, not favor freely given. The word can also mean, well, here's another example of the word meaning goodwill. He gave Joseph wisdom and enabled him to gain the goodwill of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. There's earned favor. The word can also mean thanks, as in we say, would you say grace? Would he thank the servant because he did what he was told to do? Luke 17:9. Charis means thanks or thanksgiving in that. So what determines the meaning? Well, the answer, what determines the meaning, is the context. Context determines which sense the author intended. So that's why I gave you a sentence. When I gave you a sentence, I'm introducing the context. Ephesians 2:8-9 makes it clear that this word in this context means undeserved favor. Whereas in Luke 1:30 and in Luke 6:32 and in Acts 7:10, we can see that the word carries the sense of credit or favor that is earned. And in Luke 17:9, the context is what tells you the word means thanks as opposed to favor or grace. So the context determines which sense the author intended. A third principle is that words normally have only one sense in any particular context. If I said he planted corn in his field, I don't mean the mathematical field. I mean a cultivated field. If I say the flag had stars on a field of blue, I mean the background area. Generally, I don't have multiple meanings. The reason I make this point is sometimes exegetes or interpreters will assume that a word has all of its meaning packaged together in a particular context. Generally, it doesn't. It has one meaning only. A fourth principle is that the meaning of words often changes over time. We see this perhaps most clearly in the King James Version. It's still popular among many people today, but the meaning of many words has changed. I remember sitting in a chapel service once, and I heard the pastor read James 5:11, and he said, "The Lord is very pitiful." And I thought, what? The Lord is pitiful? The Lord is not pitiful. Well, in 1611, the Lord was pitiful, because pitiful then meant full of pity or compassionate. Or how about 1 John 3:17 in the King James Version? "Whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his bowels to him." Shuts up his bowels to him. That means he's not showing compassion. Of course, that had a very different meaning in 1611. Or James 2:3, the word gay has changed its meaning since the King James Version was translated. "And ye have respect to him that weareth the gay clothing, and say unto him, Sit thou here in a good place." Gay clothing there means expensive clothing or fancy clothing. It doesn't mean homosexual in that context. Obviously, the word has changed its meaning. So words change over time. There's number 4. Here's number 5, a fifth principle of word studies. Etymology is not a reliable guide to meaning. And this is where probably most problems arise. What is etymology? Etymology refers to a word's component parts or its historical derivation. For example, pineapple, made up of 2 words, pine and apple. And yet the word pineapple doesn't mean either a pine or an apple. Outstanding, made up of 2 words, out and standing, but it doesn't mean to stand out. Well, in one sense, it actually does. Here's another one. Understand. Does understand mean to stand under? Well, of course it doesn't. Etymology does not determine the meaning of a word. Undertake doesn't mean to take under. Here's a very interesting one. The word sophomore. Sophomore comes from 2 Greek words. Sophos means wise, moros means fool. So a sophomore, literally or etymologically, means a wise fool. Well, of course, it doesn't mean that. It means a second-year student. The etymology doesn't determine the meaning of the word. Very important. A big mistake people make is to assume that if a word has 2 components, the meaning comes from those 2 components. But the meaning doesn't come from the 2 components. The meaning comes from the use of that word in context. Here's an interesting one. The quarterback. A quarterback is a quarter of the way back. Well, no one ever thinks of a quarterback in terms of being a quarter of the way back. They think the quarterback is the leader of the offense on a football team, who throws passes and hands off who receives the snap. So quarter and back have nothing to do with the meaning. So etymology does not determine the meaning of a word. Etymology can also mean historical derivation, where the word came from. The word Monday came from the word moon day. Sunday came from the word Sunday, because back in ancient times, the sun and the moon were worshipped. But of course, we would never think of Monday as being moon day or Sunday as being Sunday. The months are really interesting. September, the word sept means 7. October, the word oct means 8. November, the word nov means 9. And December, as in decimal, the word des means 10. Now notice, this is all wrong. September is the 9th month, not the 7th month. October is the 10th month, not the 8th month. November is the 11th month, not the 9th month. And December is the 12th month. So what happened? Well, the Romans originally had a 10-month calendar. When they changed their calendar, they didn't change the name of the words. So the words themselves don't mean, if you're talking about etymology or historical derivation, don't mean what they seem to indicate, because etymology is not a reliable guide to meaning. Here's a 6th conclusion to our 5 principles. The meaning of a word is determined by its semantic range, that is the various possible meanings a word can have, and then the context in which it is used. Semantic range you would determine by looking it up in a dictionary. How is the word used? What are its various possible meanings? And then determine from the context what the word means. 2 basic steps then to every word study. Determine what a word can mean, that is, its contemporary semantic range, by looking it up in a lexicon or looking it up in a dictionary. And then examine the literary context in which it's found to determine which of its possible senses it has. You should not determine the meaning based on its etymology. You should determine the meaning based on its dictionary definition and then its use in context. Let me illustrate these principles by several ways to avoid common word studies. Here are some common word study fallacies that you need to avoid. The first one is the literal or single meaning fallacy. I said earlier, you should never say the word literal with reference to words. Words don't have a literal meaning. They have a semantic range, a range of possible meanings. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. We've probably all heard the word agape, that's the verb form, agapao. The word agape means God's kind of love, and philia means human love, and then eros means lust or sexually driven love. Well, actually this is wrong. For one thing, eros, the word eros, doesn't appear anywhere in the New Testament or in the Greek Old Testament. And agape and philia don't necessarily mean God's love and human love, respectively. Let me illustrate this. Let me point out some examples. Agapao does not always mean God's kind of love. So agape is not always this special God-like love. Look at 2 Timothy 4:10 says, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me. Paul says that Demas loved the world and deserted him. That's not self-sacrificial God kind of love. That's a selfish, craving kind of love. 1 John 2:15 says, do not love the world. Agapao, the same verb, nor the things in the world. Agape or agapao there doesn't mean unselfish, God-like love. It means selfish kind of love. Don't love the world in terms of envy, being envious of the things of the world or greedy to gain the things of the world. 2 Peter 2:15, they have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the ways of Balaam, who loved the wages of wickedness. Balaam loved wickedness, or loved the wealth that he could receive from wickedness. That's not God's kind of love. Here's an extreme example. In the Old Testament, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, it says, in the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love, that's the Greek word agapao, with Tamar. And we learn shortly after that he rapes her. So this is certainly not God's kind of love that Amnon had for Tamar, for his half-sister Tamar. So you can see, agapao does not always refer to God's kind of love. It can mean simply love in its various senses that it has in English. It can mean a selfish desire. It can mean, something like loving, as in loving a ice cream or something like that. Or it can mean actual sexually driven lust. Now, it's true, certainly true, that the early Christians made this word a special word, and they used it a lot. But that doesn't mean that in every case it carries the sense of God-like love. In the same way, philia, or the verb form phileo, can mean the same as agape in certain contexts. It can mean the highest kind of love, not simply human love or friendship. Here's John 5:20, for the Father loves the Son. God the Father loves the Son. You would expect agapao in that context, but instead you get phileo. When Jesus loves Lazarus, it says, so the sister sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love. Again, you'd expect Jesus' love for Lazarus to be agapao, but it's phileo. Here's John 16:27. The Father himself loves you. God's love for us is described with phileo. Again, you would expect agapao. So these words can be used synonymously, particularly in John's Gospel. The two are often used synonymously. Here's an interesting example of that. The reference to the disciple whom Jesus loved, a reference to John, the apostle, the author of the fourth gospel. In some contexts, the disciple whom Jesus loved is agapao. In other contexts, as in John 22, it's phileo. So you can see John is clearly using these words synonymously. One area where this is often misunderstood is in John's epilogue. At the last chapter of John's Gospel, you might remember this is the restoration of Peter, where Jesus says to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And a big point is often made of the fact that Jesus changes the word he uses for love. He uses agapao first, to which Peter responds, "You know that I love you, phileo." And some have said, okay, Jesus says, "Do you really love me with a God kind of love?" And Peter says, "Well, I don't love you that much, but I like you a lot." Jesus then asks the second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me, agapao?" And Simon answers, "Lord, I like you a lot. You know that I phileo." So agapao versus phileo. And then finally, Jesus changes his word to phileo. "Simon, son of John, do you love me, phileo?" And Peter responds. Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Now, this is often taught in this way. It's often taught as though Jesus says, "Do you really love me?" with a God kind of love. Peter says, "I can't do that, but I do like you a lot." Jesus says, "Do you really love me?" with a God kind of love. Peter says, "I like you a lot." So Jesus comes down to Peter's level and say, "Okay, do you like me a lot?" And Peter says, "Yeah, I like you a lot." That's how this passage is often taught. But as we just saw, phileo and agapao are synonyms throughout John's Gospel. So almost certainly this is not about Jesus coming down to Peter's level or changing the word for love. In fact, if you notice, it says that Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time the same question. The question is asked 3 times. It's the same question in every case. So there is no difference in meaning between agapao and phileo in these contexts. John loves synonyms. He loves to use synonyms. And here's some examples of that. In the same passage, "You know that I love you." Oida is the Greek word. "You know that I love you." Oida. Verse 17, "You know that I love you." Oida. And then it changes to ginosko, another word for love, just a synonym. When Jesus responds, it says, "Feed my lambs." He says, "Feed my lambs." That's basko arnia. "Shepherd my sheep." That's poimaino probata. And "feed my sheep." That's basko probata. You see what Jesus is doing, or what John is doing. He's using synonyms to describe essentially the same thing. So this is an argument against the idea of a literal meaning. Agapao or agape does not have a literal meaning. It has a range, a semantic range. Here's a second common word study fallacy, the etymological fallacy. This is where you take 2 parts of a word and you determine its meaning by the 2 parts. Matthew 16:18. "On this rock I will build my church." You may have heard it pointed out that church, ekklesia, the Greek word for church, is made up of 2 words, ek, which means out of, and klesia, which means called, so that the church are the called out ones. Well, this is actually a fallacy. Nowhere in Greek literature does ekklesia mean called out ones. It always means an assembly, a congregation, or a gathering. It's like the Greek word synagoge, from which we get synagogue. Well, ekklesia is a gathering or an assembly. It's a congregation. It's the word that the early church chose to describe its congregation, its gathering, its meeting. And so the word doesn't mean called out ones. That's an etymological fallacy. It means the church, essentially, and a gathering of Christians. Here's another example of this. John 14:16. "I will ask the Father, he will send you another counselor." The word counselor is parakletos. We often hear it said that para means alongside of, kletos again means called, so the Holy Spirit is the one called alongside. Well, in fact, again, nowhere in Greek literature does this have this specific meaning. Parakletos can mean an advocate, a lawyer, a counselor, or a comforter. Of course, that is someone who aids or helps, but the idea that it means called alongside. No one in Greek, reading Greek, would think that this means called alongside. They would immediately think of a counselor or comforter or a lawyer or someone who's advocating on their behalf. Called alongside is another etymological fallacy. Here's a third common word study fallacy, the anachronistic fallacy. This is a fallacy that says the word gets its meaning from a later derivation. Romans 1:16. I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for salvation. You may have heard it said that the word power here is dunamis. Dunamis. What word do we get from dunamis? We get the word dynamite. And so the gospel is the dynamite of God. Well, that's an anachronistic fallacy. It's taking a later derivation and putting it back on an earlier use. Of course, dunamis can't mean dynamite, can't have meant dynamite. Dynamite wasn't invented back then. And so that's taking a later meaning and falsely attributing it to an earlier time. Dunamis means power or authority. That's what it meant in context. Here's another example of an anachronistic fallacy. 2 Corinthians 9:7. For God loves a cheerful giver. The Greek word cheerful is hilaros. Well, what word do we get from hilaros? Hilarious. So God loves a hilarious giver. But in fact, the Greek word hilaros did not mean hilarious back in the first century. It meant cheerful. That's why it's translated that way. So it's an anachronistic fallacy to impose a later derivation onto an earlier meaning. Now, some people have said, well, these are just harmless or memorable illustrations. But in fact, you can produce heresy by doing this kind of etymology. The word sovereign, when it says sovereign lord, is despotes. We get the word despot from that, or a tyrant. Well, God is not a tyrant. That's a false etymology. Here's another example. Romans 8:32 says, God did not spare his own son. The Greek word for own is idios. We, of course, get the word idiot from idios. God did not spare his idiot son. Well, of course, that's absolutely wrong. That is not what the word means. The word means his own. So we shouldn't take a later derivation and impose it back onto the word. Here's a final, letter D, a final word study fallacy you should avoid, the all-inclusive meaning fallacy. This is taking all the various possible meanings a word can have and bringing it to bear on a single usage. One translation that commonly makes this error is the Amplified Bible. Here's Galatians 3:1 in the NIV. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. Notice the Amplified. It takes each word and expands upon it. You poor and silly and thoughtless and unreflecting and senseless Galatians, who has fascinated or bewitched or cast a spell on you, unto whom right before your very eyes, Jesus Christ the Messiah, translating Christ twice, can either mean Christ or can mean the Messiah. They translate it both ways, was openly and graphically set forth and portrayed as crucified. This translation suggests that each of these words in Greek is packed full of meaning, and you need to bring out all of those meanings. In fact, each of those senses is, one of those senses is the meaning. It's not silly or thoughtless or unreflecting or senseless. It's one of those meanings. That's an all-inclusive meaning fallacy. Be sure to avoid that one as well. Finally, again, principles to avoid word study fallacies. Here's our conclusion. Principles to avoid word study fallacies. Meaning is determined by the context, by the contemporary semantic range and the context, not by word roots or etymology. As a general rule, study English sentences, not Greek words. In other words, words have meaning in context, so read the larger context. Don't try to unpack the word like you'd unpack a suitcase. Third, read for the contextual meaning, not some hidden Greek meaning. You have excellent English translations. You can trust those translations. And compare various English versions. When there is a possible difference, the different versions will bring them out when there's two possible meanings. And then finally, especially, check the better commentaries. The commentaries are going to study words in context. So once again, when you're doing a word study, determine what the word can mean, its semantic range, and then identify specifically what it means by studying it in its particular context. It's quite simple in that regard, not overly complicated. Don't determine the meaning of a word by its roots, by its etymology, or by its later derivation. This concludes this particular slideshow.